Hi, everybody. Okay. Hello. It's great to be here. I have to say, I got to meet some of you last night. I'm just so impressed with really what Mo has done, pulling you all together. It's clear that we have not only the power in the sector here, but also the passion. And I think both of those are so important. I am, let's see here. My name is Sandra Seru, so I'm managing director of the U.S. branch of a nonprofit called Forum for the Future. Forum is a sustainability nonprofit. I'm trying, like many of you, trying to address an accelerated transition to a just and sustainable world. We started about 22 years ago, really as the first organization working with the private sector on sustainable development issues. At that time, we started the first master's program in sustainable development. But over time, as the field of sustainability has changed and professionalized and grown, which is all great news, we ourselves have changed, really trying to address what the needs are right now. And about 7 years ago, we started identifying as a systems change organization. How can we really look and change our practice to make sure that all our efforts are adding up? That's the topic today for us to talk about. But the way we do this is we work with organizations that really want to drive absolute outcomes rather than incremental change. We catalyze these systemic initiatives with multiple stakeholders to try to intervene in systems that might disproportionately impact the goals that we're trying to set, and I'll give you an example of what one of those is. And then we work with people in their personal practice. We run what we call the School of Systems Change, so the old master's program. It's very controversial. We shut it down. There's hundreds of master's programs of sustainable development now. And now it's more of an executive leadership, roving executive leadership, really working on personal practice and systemic change. So that is us. That's who you're hearing today. What I want to talk about today is why this kind of thinking is so critical to accelerate the goals that we all know and need. What systems change is. We'll talk about what it is, what it might look like in practice, and what you guys could start doing, and including me. It's a learning journey starting today. Okay, so I probably don't need to really go through our report card here as to how we're doing. But really, there's so much to celebrate. As I said, you're really hard-pressed to find a big multinational company not thinking about sustainability issues. There's a groundswell of new innovation, which is in the room. But really, when we look at the outcomes that we're trying to shift, we're not seeing progress. In fact, it's getting scary. So I'm just pulling out a few of the areas we think are particularly important, particularly to this community, to start to think about and understand how they're all interlinked. So in the top left corner, meet George. Sadly, George died this year, and so did his species. His species is now extinct. He's a tree snail, but he's being joined every year with at least 10,000, up to 100,000 species a year that are going extinct. We're in a period, it's the sixth time this mass extinction is going through, and a lot of people, most people are pointing to agriculture as the main contributor to what is happening. Meanwhile, this biodiversity is absolutely impacting practice in everything that we rely on, all the resources that as an agriculture community we rely on. So that is one major thing that we need to think about addressing. Climate, I think, goes without saying that we're in a time of unprecedented catastrophe. It's interesting, we're here in beautiful Miami, and they're saying by 2030 that flooding might be something that'll be a natural occurrence every day. Also, we're already seeing impacts on freshwater supplies as saltwater is impacting kind of supplies here in this area. So I think it's actually quite apt for us to be sitting here really thinking about what the future might hold and how we need to shift it. Of course, agriculture is potentially up to 25% of the problem in this, and also obviously is incredibly impacted by these shifts and the security of our food and resources. So that's another area to be thinking about. Equity, inequality is on the rise. I think we've seen, on the one hand, the poorest of the poor we're seeing a lot of progress there, but we're still seeing inequality across the board. And what's interesting to think about is inequality is happening all along the food chain. So on the one hand, in consumption, there are massive health impacts. 1 in 9 children are going hungry. We were making progress on that, but around 2015, it's been taking a nosedive there. But nutrition is absolutely being impacted, all kinds of impacts of that. But then on the supply side, really thinking about how is inequity playing out with farmers. Farmers make up 75% of the world's poor. Meanwhile, I think we think of agriculture as really a tool to help lift farmers out of this poverty. But I think as work is changing and automation and thinking about actually a positive movement in alternative proteins, I think the question becomes, are farmers being left behind, or are they, is value being extracted from the system from their standpoint there? And finally, health. What's happening in health in terms of non-communicable diseases, of which our diets are such a big part of. It's supposed to account for over 70% of deaths every year. And so much of that is diet related, and we do have we have the tools in place to change that. So the report card is kind of depressing. I'm sorry to start us off on that note. I think what's we'll pick you guys back up, I promise. But what's something to think about is each one of these issues is absolutely related to each other. We could be actually including all these issues under an umbrella biodiversity strategy, an umbrella climate strategy. They're all completely related. So just to take an example, I think so many of us really believe that we need to transition to more plant-based diets. If we approach that problem without thinking about what's happening in agriculture, the nutrients in our soil is going to go back and impact nutrition. We might be leaving farmers out of that equation. To actually address all of these issues, when you push on one thing, you might pull on another. And I think what we're trying to do today is really understand how these things are interconnected. Okay, but wait. There's more. So if you thought, okay, great, we'll just look at root causes, we're fine, we'll start to just create smarter strategies. There's all these other things that are just swirling around in the world that we don't normally think about when we think about sustainability challenges. So these are macro problems. For example, thinking about nationalism and how that's impacting policy and impacting mindset shifts that will make our work more difficult. On the other hand, there are positive signals of change in terms of the surgence of social media and digital life, and how it's easier to actually be able to speak to people. And we're seeing, a surge of #vegan, just really showing, that choice as a status symbol. So these are tools that we do have at our disposal. And then there's these wild card situations, like the changing consumerism in Asia, which has a complete disproportionate impact in anything you want to do in consumer behavior. And the question is, are we going to see more meatier and milkier consumption? Or are we going to see the opposite? We're actually seeing positive signals, but there are certain parts of the world where some of these shifts are more important than others to think about. So if you're not totally overwhelmed yet, I think there are tools to help us make sense of all this, and that's what we'll start to talk about today. I love this quote from Buckminster Fuller that we do have the ability to not be victims of the future and to take a step forward together. So let's think about that as we go into this next thing. So the first tool is just recognizing that everything's connected. And I love this quote from Donella Meadows. She was a U.S. thought leader in systems change. And she essentially is saying that the world is complex, it's interconnected, but we treat it as if it was not. So we treat it as if we are empowered to make change without looking at what everybody else is doing. And she's saying that is the fundamental reason why we're not seeing progress. So just understanding that and that mindset shift for ourselves as change makers is the first tool to start to think about how to make a difference. All right, so what do we mean by a system? This gets a little theoretical here. A system is anything. A system is this room. We're a system. We're going to change. We're going to go on a coffee break. Everything's about to shift. It changes the global economy. It's Miami. You can set the boundary in any way, but the shift in thinking is that we go from individual parts into a whole. And I think this the one thing I just want to call out. I think you hear a lot of rhetoric saying the system is broken, we need to fix it, and just kind of the slight shift on thinking that I'd like to just point to is that the system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. So the only way to shift things is actually rewiring the system, changing relationships, changing the way things are done. And that if we keep going forward with whatever solution we have without kind of looking at how those fundamental relationships are shifting, we're not going to get the progress that we want. Okay, so another big principle is thinking about our own role in the system. And you might be asking why I have these various patterns up. Does anyone want to guess kind of what are you looking at here? What are some of these things? What was that? Uh-huh. Anything else? So I get kind of river systems, leather, porcupine, kind of all kinds of guesses. And those are all pieces of a big old elephant in the room. And the point here is that it's really hard to get perspective, especially for those of us that are passionate about what we're trying to do. We're just kind of really siloed and trying to make progress into what we're doing. But sometimes you don't realize kind of what you're connected to and what else is going on. And so you need to find ways to lift yourself up to get that perspective. And it's really hard. You can even say, I want perspective, but it actually means different kinds of conversations, putting yourselves in uncomfortable positions, finding these platforms to get to know others and trying to understand how they are connected to what you're doing. So you might, when you think about where you are in the system, this is a helpful way to think about it. There's, we really see there's 3 major levels of a system. There's 1,000 tools in systems change. I'm just pulling out a simple one just to help us think about this. And this is one of our most fundamental frameworks. At the very top, you have the landscape. So I think when we were talking before about these trends in nationalism and shifting mindsets and policy shifts, those are all the players that are really influencing the way we think and the way we act. The regime is it says here business as usual. It's big industry that could equally be big government. It's really the major infrastructure and that's in place to make the system go. And at the bottom we have the niche. These are the innovators. This is the tech world in a lot of cases. These are folks that are trying to disrupt the system. And what's important for us is that really when change happens, when truly systemic change happens, it's when both of these pressures are happening at the same time on the regime, where you have shifts in mindset and expectations and policy coming at you from the top, and then the niche really seeing the opportunity to scale that makes the regime realize, oh, we now need to catch up and really rework things. So if you are in any part of this system, really a helpful thing to think about is how do you get this perfect storm to happen? Who else would you need to work with to make sure that fundamental change is happening? So these are different strategies that we've identified. You're going to read them and say, right, this is not really that fundamental here. And most of you are doing them. So, at the landscape level, we're talking about making the case. Some of these are academic cases or whatever we need to shift mindsets, really trying to get people to be introduced to different ways of working, looking at the policy level, right? At the regime level, I know a lot of you are working in data. That's kind of the genesis of a lot of this work. In providing equitable information flows and structures is really important. Creating those incentives to fundamentally shift business models and financing. Developing new rules for the regime and standards so people kind of recognize what is best practice, right? And at the niche level, it's creating new and disruptive innovation, but also ensuring the routes to scale. Great. I don't think there's too much there that's new and novel, but I think the key is wherever hopefully you're in one of these bubbles. If not, I want to talk and we can kind of figure out where you might fit. But wherever you are in this bubble, recognize that the folks that are doing these other change tactics are related to what you're doing, and you need to work together to really create that change. So I'm going to just kind of talk through an example, like kind of a live experimental example that Forum is working on. I mentioned that we work individually with organizations and change makers themselves, but we also try to establish what pioneering practice is and try to identify proof points that will help build the case for systems thinking. At the top of that framework that I just mentioned. And so this is an example. We often, a lot of our work, particularly with individual organizations, is thinking about the future and what the future holds and how they might future-proof their own strategy. And the impetus for addressing the protein challenge, which happened about 10 years ago, was working with the dairy industry and recognizing that, oh wait, the protein system as we know it is not going to be able to feed a growing population of 9 billion people, certainly not within planetary boundaries, and thinking about affordable and healthy options. What are we going to do? So out of some of that futures scenario work, we started thinking about protein as a system. So as far as we know, this is the first time that different players across the protein system are looking at this as a system in itself. So we're getting the global agriculture industry together with alternative protein examples and folks and the meat industry all kind of looking at this. And there's lots of different ways to map a system. This is kind of what we came up with, just really trying to understand the different connections between everything. There's no way you can read this. I'm sorry, I can't even read it when I look at PowerPoint. If you are curious, I can give you a file that you can zoom out. But just some of the, I think there were some aha moments when we really looked about the cumulative impacts of this group as we think about it as a group and not just targeting ag, for example. At it, but there were really interesting, at least for us, insights about the role of animal feed and how we are funneling so much potential protein that could go to humans and address a lot of these issues, but going to animals. So I know we have a community working on fisheries, but despite fish stocks depleting, I think from 1970, they can correct me if I'm wrong, in half since 1970, about 20% of it is going actually into animal feed, and so that could be redirected. So I think there were some insights there as to how the system could be reworked. So really after diagnosis and really understanding how everything's playing together, you start to think about, okay, what could be done here? And we'll just tell you what we've been doing with our partners. So it used to be a lonely world, thinking about how to shift diets and increasing plant-based protein by 50% 10 years ago. We're seeing so much shift in the dialogue and the change then. But that's something we continue to work on. We've focused mostly on the UK and the US. Here in the US, I can tell you that we've started with the US school lunch program for a few different reasons, but it's the biggest restaurant chain in America, for one, and we really see students as agents for change in themselves, and we've been working with different food service directors to understand, okay, what's happening. What we're hearing from them is that there's not enough options. They just literally don't have the options to provide plant-based protein to their students, but also there's just no demand. There's no demand from parents, there's no demand from children, so what can we do? And so we're working both with manufacturers and the school districts on new innovation and new ways to think about menuing, and then coupling that with an engagement campaign. And that's just one little example as to what we might do, and I'll talk about how that could work out in scale. But that's something we're doing on the consumption side, but we never want to just take an intervention on one side of the system without looking at the other. So we're looking at animal feed. There was really no way of evaluating what sustainable feed was, so that's the kind of work and research that we've done. We're hoping to really reduce the dependency of the global food system on things like soy and other food that could enter into the human consumption pattern. So that's something that we're working on. Then there's all these other areas like hopes and dreams that we think that we'd want to take a look at. How do we eliminate the waste in the protein system? How do we look at indigenous plants as protein sources? Scaling up aquaculture. Well, we can talk about that, and maybe moving there, and restoring soil health. We actually are bidding, and hopefully will be doing a massive piece of systems change work on regenerative agriculture, which sits outside the protein system much more broadly. But anyway, those are some of the work we're doing, some of the ideas that we have, and we hope that by adding all this up, that we would see fundamental change. The third step, once you've started doing that, is obviously scale, but there's all kinds of caveats before you move to scale. I think there's a bit of humility in doing this. Sure, we run a school systems change, but this is such a learning practice. We're learning all the time, and there's real live questions that we are constantly evolving and holding to make sure that we're having the traction that we want. So who ourselves, we're always on the lookout at who are other enablers that we could be working together with to make sure that we're seeing our ultimate vision, who might be losing out. I think we're taking on as a live question what some of the innovation work we're doing in the school system could have on farmers, and what to do there, how to ensure equity in what consumers ultimately get, as we think about the quality of the food and the availability. And how do we make sure, I think a big thing is make sure that this future that might have lots of alternative proteins and different tactics, that we're still celebrating taste, nutrition, and the health outcomes. So these are all some of the life questions that we're holding ourselves. And I think it's just important to recognize that no matter where you are in this journey, that you're constantly asking these questions and adapting your practice in partnership. So that's kind of a case study at a systems level. I think if you're a single organization, you might be thinking, wow, what am I really going to do all that? I mean, I think you can be thinking about where your dependencies are. You can be thinking about what kinds of platforms you would need to exist that you would then join and help support. But fundamentally, at a strategic level, we've been thinking, how can we really support organizations with their own individual strategies to enable that systemic change? And so we've been working with other sustainability organizations and universities to develop what we're calling the net positive principles. So this is like a completely other talk. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I won't dwell too much on it. I'm happy to talk more about it. But these are principles that are meant to help you understand where to start and what to do. And I think ultimately the very first principle is what is material. And we're recognizing that truly the premise of the net positive strategy is that you as an organization are giving back more to the environment and society than what you're taking out. That's huge, and so you potentially can't do that across every single issue that your organization is impacting. How do you focus in, and how do you focus in a way that's not a detriment to other related issues? So I think there's some caveats there. These principles are meant to help you think of enabling positive self-replicating cycles, so you wouldn't necessarily need your investment every year that this work would live on. Of course, that it's systemic and what that means, and principles to support that, and transparent. I think, we were just talking about how this is a learning journey, and no matter what we do, we're going to end up doing something wrong, and you won't ever quite know what that is if your stakeholders and supportive community around you don't know what you're doing, and being transparent is such a key part of all that. So I'm just going to end this slide, and the next slide is really about the how. And there's so many things you could do. There are these tools, there's this practice, but really how you do this is much more important than what you end up doing. And there's huge value in just understanding, as we talked, understanding the context that you are in and what your role in that system is. Huge benefits in really understanding what your dependencies are, at least to be aware of them and to track how those things are evolving, to constantly learning and adapting. And the last one is this recognizing that change is personal. To do this work well, you really need a sense of humility. You need to be an active listener. You need to be willing to collaborate. These aren't necessarily easy things. They're not necessarily natural to all of us. I know that kind of my own work, constantly working on my own individual approaches to this, because really the way that you're doing this completely could undermine the actual work in general. So I'm lucky that I was one of the first speakers to think, because I think there are things that you could all be thinking about over the next 2 days. I think it's really easy to point your finger at others that you're the problem, and maybe do a little bit of introspection. Where might I be the problem, or what am I dependent on to succeed? And I think as you hear other speakers talk, really evaluate, do I need their success for me to succeed? When we look back at that report card, is this a partnership that I really need to happen to make an impact? So I think hopefully that kind of thinking will help us all accelerate a transition to change. So thank you very much.
All right.